I have a cargo hold full of distilled spirits and some spores which are actually probably hallucinate, genetic and addictive and therefore vice, as well as some processed foods. So I'm heading to Arcop to Baljini Point, the space station orbiting Arcop that buys these things. But meanwhile, let me just talk about StarCitizen and its technical requirements. I think it's a StarCitizen actually has a fairly robust, it requires fairly new hardware. I think one of the main problems is, this is StarCitizen's website itself, and it lists down the minimum requirements. So it says that it needs Windows 8.1 minimum, a Sandy Bridge or later CPU, and explain why. DirectX 11 compatible graphics cards with a minimum of 3 GB VRAM, 16 GB of memory, and 80 GB of storage space. StarCitizen introduced patch 3.11 alpha in 2020, and 3.11 alpha was when it specified that the game needed to run AVX instructions. So AVX instructions are what Intel calls, let me just look at my notes here, the advanced, let me see what it stands for, vector extensions. And because of that, you need a Sandy Bridge or better CPU, and for AMD you need AMD Bulldozer or higher. But these are minimum specifications, and StarCitizen has actually a very interesting website called the Telemetry Dashboard that actually looks at the average setups for different players playing the game. And let me just take a look. So this is the telemetry setup, and with it you find, let me just close some of my windows here. I really have some trouble. Yep, sorry. It's very confusing when I have two screens showing the same thing. So this is the RSI or StarCitizen telemetry dashboard. Basically what it does is it polls people's hardware configuration every hour, and then because it tells the servers what FPS each player is able to get. You'll find that it runs this graph, and I think what happens is you're able to see the kind of hardware people are running with to achieve the resolutions that they get. So taking a look at achieving a 1920 by 1080 resolution, you'll find that the minimum hardware that gives you minimum reasonable hardware that gives you 30 FPS is actually not very high. So you're looking at Intel i7-7770s, i5-9400s, paired with a GTX 1060 GB. So the game is playable at 30 FPS average with this setup. And then if you look at the ideal setup, so at 46.5 FPS, you're actually, all you require is really a Ryzen 5 5600 or a Ryzen 7 2700, and you can get by with 11 Gen i7 chip quite easily. Of course, what seems to be the case here is that people are pairing it up with an RTX 3080. I see here that it also works with a GTX 1080. So these are the 1080 is a fairly old CPU. It's quite a venerable CPU that is one of my favorites really. So it runs well at 46.5 FPS. And of course, if you want to go to ideal setups that hit about 60 FPS average, then you're looking at the AMD Ryzen 7 5800X or 12 Gen 12600K paired with a 3070 Ti RTX graphic card, AMD Radeon RX 690 XT or RTX 3080. So you will find that the graphic card plays a role as well. Of course, for those of you who are running resolution at 2560 by 1440, which is actually a very common resolution in game these days, you can either do one or two things, and this is a very curious thing here. You can either run a fairly old CPU to hit 68.2 FPS with a RTX 3090 GPU, and I'll explain this a little bit later. So long as you have a strong GPU and a fairly old CPU, you're able to get high frame rates. So this is a GPU specific setup. On the other hand, if you have a relatively weaker GPU like the RTX 2080 Ti, which is really last gen, and RTX 3080s, you need a slightly beefier CPU to compensate for slightly less graphical processing power. So StarCitizen is quite unique in the sense that it actually runs actually both CPU computing power and GPU computing power are important. Yeah, so these are some of the green are the ones where you hit about at 40 FPS. These are kind of like your average recommended settings for 1440p, and this is the setup. I shan't repeat what I'm saying. Anyway, I also think that I'm about to land in my destination. I don't want to linger in orbit around a cop just in case the cops show up and start giving me problems. So this is a similar thing. You'll find that if you run 4K, for those of you who are tempted to go 4K, you find that it's not possible to hit 60 FPS with 4K unless you got super beefy CPU. There is a reason for that, because you're just pumping up so much more pixels. Okay, I have reached. Let me just aim to dock at Baljini Point if I can find it. Just nice Baljini Points here. 500 km away. And then once docked in Baljini Point, I can continue my discussion of
engaged. Quantum travel complete.
Yeah, guys, watch your speed when you're doing this. I have crashed many times because I've approached a station too fast. You got to remember two things. One, your speed. There's significant lag in terms of your speed. How your ships change direction in space. So you find that in my current setup, you see the white cursor here, the white notch there. That's actually the true heading of my ship. So even though I'm pointed at this direction, you see that white chevron, it lags. It takes a while before the true heading of the ship catches up. Anyway, let me request for landing permission, and hopefully they will assign me a nearby landing bay. It's not too bad. It's fairly near. Yeah. So do bear in mind when you're flying spacecraft in StarCitizen. Every ship has a lag between when its true heading changes and with what you're actually looking at and the direction that you're looking at. So it varies. The Hercules C2 is very maneuverable for its size, but larger ships do have a lot of momentum and therefore a significant amount of lag.
Landing gear down.
I like the space stations sometimes because they tend to have fairly wide berths, although not in this case for some reason. I will probably have to fit myself through a tiny hole as usual. Okay, and then just as I had done when I was taking off, it doesn't. It helps to go into veto mode because it reduces the width of my ship. And when you fly a big ship like this, you could remember there are always protruding parts. Like I have a fairly tall tail. Yeah. So I'm in the force field area. And I should be good. Yep. So yeah, I've landed at Baljini Point. Well, I am landing at Baljini Point. Did I knock over something? No, I didn't. Yeah, so I've got the ship's auto land mode on. Yep, so I'm safely docked at Baljini Point. Let me just, before I forget, refuel, although I am no danger of running out of fuel. But yeah, always no harm to refuel every time we land. Yeah, so
engines on.
let me just get out the ship. store it, and then I can talk a little bit more about hardware settings. So guys, actually what I'm doing is what I call a cargo run. Essentially it's my way of making money, because you know it's not so focused. I mean, if I were to do a combat bounty mission, I really have to focus on what I'm doing. Whereas if I'm doing a cargo run, there are times when I'm actually in transit, like just now when I was traveling from Hypotech to Arcop. There plenty of time for me to talk about stuff like hardware. So Star Citizen is very strange. Well, in many ways it's a fairly unoptimized game, so its hardware requirements tend to be a little higher than say other games of equivalent capabilities. And I can understand why, because while you are trying to design and rework this game, or trying to constantly try and patch it, add new features to it, you can't finalize some of the core codes, and therefore there doesn't make any point to optimize it. Like for example, if you are using NVIDIA drivers, you find there's no profile NVIDIA profile for Star Citizen. So I think it's common knowledge that you can get easily between 10 to 20% more performance once your graphic card has an optimized profile for the game that you're running. Star Citizen doesn't have that. Hopefully it will come soon when it maybe at Alpha 4.0 and the engine's a bit more stable. There is talk by RSI or CIG, the developers for Star Citizen, that there will be some further changes and especially optimizations to the game engine. So with that, I would hope that the hardware requirements actually go down. But check out the telemetry page of the Star Citizen website to see what are the kind of hardware people are running in order to get the FPSs that they desire. I think it's a very useful resource and it's very helpful. But you'll be surprised that Star Citizen actually runs a wide gamut of hardware. Let me just store my ship first. For those of you who don't know, especially in orbital stations where there's high traffic, there's a chance that your ship can get impounded if you leave it in a dock, in a landing pad, without storing it, like what I did just now. So yeah, I mean, for those of you who want to find out, another question, those of you who want to find out what your FPS is, press the tilde key and type these following words: r_display info. You can do 1 to 3. 3 is the most verbose with the most information. And then once you do that, on your top right hand side of your screen, you should see an FPS marker. The letters are a bit tiny because I'm running 4K. I'm getting about 57 to 59 FPS per second in a station. Interestingly, Star Citizen actually runs slower when you're inside the space station. Ooh, nice view. So I think it's because it's just more objects to render. And speaking of rendering, Star Citizen is actually extremely memory intensive when it comes graphic memory intensive when it comes to rendering. That's really because a lot of its hardware is a lot of its codes are unoptimized. So they just basically load the profiles of the shaders, all the other graphical data is loaded raw without any kind of compression. So I think that's one of the reasons why Star Citizen has a lot of relatively high hardware requirements. That said, there was some talk earlier that if you would increase your graphic card's memory buffer to 10 up to 10 GB, you will get better performance. I don't think so. I tried it. I didn't get very much more performance, but your mileage may vary. And yeah, I didn't think that I benefited much from it. And at the same time, I didn't make much money with this. And at the same time, I actually lost some, tiny amount of money with this. I actually had a bit of a performance hit with the higher hardware requirements. So I actually don't think it's very accurate to do that. I think it's probably just I wouldn't say a misnomer, but I think it was just something someone discovered that was probably patched over and fixed in the months since the thing came out. I think almost a year ago. But if you are running, I can imagine the whole problem with increasing your graphic card buffer memory size is that you are using up more RAM. And if you don't have enough RAM, like say you don't have 32 GB of RAM, you'll find that you'll be writing to a swap file on your computer or your main boot drive more often, and that actually results in a greater performance hit. So your mileage may vary. If you're running a 32GB setup, and if your graphic card has fairly low amount of VRAM, like say 4 or 8GB. In fact, 8 I think is plenty. But if you have 4GB or 6GB like the 3060s do, then you might benefit from this. I'm running a RTX 3090, and with 24GB VRAM, I didn't experience any benefit by increasing the VRAM buffer size at the NVIDIA driver. So it didn't work for me. It might work for you. But the other thing I would also recommend, everybody knows that the Intel 12 Gen CPUs are actually great CPUs. But if you're running Intel 12 Gen, you should run Windows 11. Reason is because the 12 Gen CPUs have what they call both performance cores and E-cores, similar to the M1 architecture. And while this setup, which Intel calls the Big Little architecture, benefits power consumption, and in fact it benefits heat management, which also enables the P-cores to run a bit faster and better. The problem is that if you do not have an operating system that is able to talk to the thread director of the 12 Gen CPU or the Alder Lake CPU, you get a performance hit. So if Windows 10 assumes that all your cores are the same, just like all the CPUs that come before Alder Lake, all the Intel CPUs that come before Alder Lake, and it assigns a thread or process to a core that is an efficiency core, you will get a massive performance hit. So the solution to this is to install Windows 11. I know some of you have heard about Windows 11's problems at launch, but I must say, nearly a year on, Windows 11 is actually very stable. And to me, an upgrade to Windows 11 is an inevitable thing. So if you're running 12 Gen Intel chips, go for the Windows 11. It's free anyway. I mean, it's free if you own a copy of Windows 10, right? So these are, but there are a couple of things to bear in mind too. If you want to optimize your hardware experience in StarCitizen, take a look at this options page here. I find that the best performance comes from running full screen. Borderless is second, Windows is the worst. If you have a fairly high quality CPU, like a fairly modern CPU as in 2 years old or so, and say for example a 3007 or even a 5007 or 5006 AMD, you can run it on very high. This setting, interestingly enough, affects or uses up more computing power of your CPU than your GPU's power. However, if you're looking at things like the scatter object distance, your terrain tessellation distance, and your planet volumetric clouds, these are GPU intensive. So you might want to adjust and lower them if your CPU is not so modern or not so powerful. So for me, I have it set all on high. In fact, I think you get diminishing returns with things like volumetric clouds, and so I run it at high. I don't run it at very high because I see no point. For the little benefit, there's no point doing it. Personally, also I've noticed, thanks to Radic for sharing this as well, things like motion blur, chromatic aberration, and sharpening actually do affect your FPS. It's a small hit, but it's there, particularly for motion blur. Anyway, as a gamer, why do I want to introduce motion blur to my game? I turn it off. First instance, I have most games anyway. Sharpening, turn it off entirely. Chromatic aberration, turn it off entirely. You will be able to squeeze just a little bit more performance from it. Similar for film grain as well. So if you want to squeeze performance out of your current hardware, turn off motion blur, turn off sharpening, turn on chromatic aberration, and turn off film grain. You may want to also turn off VSync. It will give you slightly more FPS, but if you start noticing tearing and you don't have a G-Sync or FreeSync setup, then I suggest you just turn it back on again, because I think tearing on something like a game is really unbearable. So these are some of the tweaks you can do within StarCitizen itself. Otherwise, I really don't think you need to do much more to get performance out of the game. I must say I think StarCitizen is actually far more scalable than most people let it on to be. Reason is, I mean, you just take a look at the telemetry site here, and you find that wait a minute. Okay. You find that the hardware requirements are actually quite varied enough. So if you're not running, okay, not many people have 4K setup. But really, I think what's optimal for most people, if you're running at 1440 and you don't have an ultra-wide screen, I think a setup like this, Ryzen 5 600X or 370X with a 1080 or 360 GPU, which actually is quite common these days, is enough to get great FPS. In fact, I do notice some YouTubers, some of they even stream. Maybe they're using a 2 PC setup, but whatever it is, StarCitizen runs on their 3060 for a very decent 40 to 50 FPS. In fact, if I'm not wrong, Radic was formerly an Alliance member at NSFW on the SDFC's server 195. He runs on a 3060 fine and there's no problems, and he is able to best me in top fighting any day. So this probably ends my video on the requirements of StarCitizen, hardware requirements of StarCitizen. Basic point is, don't get intimidated by it. It really doesn't require as high an amount of computing power as it is apparent. It's just a matter of tweaking and trying to optimize your setup. So if you do want to play StarCitizen and you do have some queries on how best to optimize your setup, just have a reach out to me. Those of you in NSFW Alliance would know how to get hold of me on our Alliance Discord. Otherwise, leave a comment below. Anyway, if you have some views and other things to share about StarCitizen, and especially with regards to its hardware specifications, I welcome your comments. Share your hardware setups and let us know what you have been able to achieve based on the hardware that you have, and just to see if the telemetry page on the RSI website is indeed accurate. So anyway, this is Starus. I'm going to finish my trade run and get rid of all the other cargo. And if you notice, I actually bought some scrap just to fill up my cargo so I don't make an entry trip to Arcop. Most of the planet side trade and development division are basically their trade centers, except things like scrap anyway, so might as well just land on the planet with some cargo as opposed to landing at sea. Anyway, I'll do a video on cargo running later on, but this is Starus, and about today's topic is really about just the hardware requirements of StarCitizen. So anyway, I'll see you guys out there, and thank you very much. Have a good day or evening wherever you are.